So, since last week, it turns out that the Bronze Age beaker people, when they moved into Britain, known for their distinctive pottery beakers, actually almost completely eliminated the previous Neolithic population of Britain. Totally new. Only just discovered through new DNA sequencing. So, and turns out, 64,000 years ago, Neanderthal men, women, people were creating cave art, painting. New painting in the south of France has been dated, definitively dated to the Neanderthal period, which previously Neanderthals were not thought to have exhibited any evidence of symbolic thought. So this is, you don't know what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks. The whole of world history is changing before your very eyes. Anyway, so the sort of premise of one of the things I've sort of been trying to do is sort of organize each of the talks around a couple of sort of big ideas. And the big idea I want to talk about today, and it sort of fits in the time sequence, is to talk about the complex interrelationship between the semi-nomadic pastoralist peoples on the Eurasian steppes and their relationship, their changing relationship, their impact and consequences for the settled agricultural societies around the fringes of Eurasia. So the region I'm going to be talking about, this is not exactly what it looks like. This is a color-enhanced image, but it's basically that sort of bluey, turquoisey region in the stretching from Eastern Europe through the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and all the way through Mongolia to Manchuria in northeast of China. So a huge geographical region. Ecologically, very similar to the western prairie grasslands in the modern United States. I'll say a little bit maybe about that later. So the home of animal herders, sheep, goats, seasonal migrants moving north and south depending on the seasons, north in the summer, south in the winter. Think yurts, think movable homes, pretty much everything pretty much all your property collapsible into carts, tribal societies, relatively small groups of people. Women still have significant social status. Shamanistic religions, very sort of close to nature religions. A little bit later we're going to see Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, which is a branch of Christianity. It's almost, I think, completely extinct now. And later still Islam. Peoples who move great distances. The Huns, the Magyar, probably the most familiar in terms of the western end of Eurasia, the Xiongnu, the Manchu in the east, and then of course the Mongols themselves, who I'll talk a little bit about later. And I'm also going to add a sort of by comparison some comments on the pastoralist peoples from the Arabian Peninsula, the Great Explosion, Arab explosion, expansion from the 600s onwards. So there's two sort of sides to this story that I want to talk a little bit about today. This is sometimes conceptualized, and I put it in that first slide, as the relationship between the steppe, i.e. the steppe nomadic peoples, and the Sown, i.e. the agricultural communities, the agricultural societies around the fringes of Eurasia. So historically this begins with the Proto-Indo-European peoples So we're sort of jumping back in time from last week's lecture, 4,000 or so BCE to about 1,000 BCE. So these are Neolithic and then Bronze Age peoples. You can see this is a sort of there's a huge amount of debate over the exact course of all of this. I'm not going to get into it in any detail, but you can see the theoretical model, the homeland, heartland in that Trans-Caspian region, and then movement outwards into Greece, into Anatolia, into modern-day Persia, northern India, interacting with the settled communities in all of those regions. So several of the settled communities that I've been talking about previously, Mycenaean Greece, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Persians, undoubtedly having interrelationship with the steppe nomadic peoples. Okay, that's just. I just wanted to throw that in so you don't see these people just sort of popping up out of nowhere. I want to make one additional sort of observation. This expansion coincides with the domestication of the horse. So if you think about, I made the point about the American steppes or the Great Plains, only really open to native settlement after the arrival of the horse. So actually, what we often think of as sort of the ancient traditions of the Plains Indians, only beginning after the 1500s, with the arrival through the Spanish of horses that escape and go wild and then are captured by and tamed by Native Americans. So obviously the mobility of the horse is going to play a big part in this. Okay, background, move forward. We talked in the last lecture last week about the two great Iron Age empires at both ends of Eurasia. The Roman Empire around the littoral of the Mediterranean on the left there, and Han China, actually a little bit exaggerated. They didn't really, that whole sort of reaching out to the Tarim Basin there was really not as much under Han control as the map would give you cause to believe, but nevertheless, these two huge population centers at either end of Eurasia, both about 50 million, population about 50 million people. What I want to talk a little bit today is to think about the connections between them. So here, some of the trade routes about 400 CE. You can see trade routes down in the far left of the picture, down from Egypt down the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. Big networks of trade into the Persian Gulf, to India. It's not really shown on the map, but at the same time there were definitely trade routes down the Swahili coast of Africa, the east coast of Africa, round the southern tip of India into the Bay of Bengal, into Southeast Asia, and then on to China. So already in the 1st century CE, pretty dense networks of trade, seaborne trade. Romans for sure know a little bit about China. They know quite a lot about India. There's not many Romans who actually go all the way to China. There may be one or two. There's not many Chinese who go all the way to the Roman Empire. There may be one or two, but there's certainly a lot of goods that start getting passed from trader to trader to trader through these networks. So bear those in mind. These networks of trade expanding and contracting over time, but are going to be going on all through the period I'm talking about today. But what I'm more interested today is these routes, the overland routes at the top of the illustration there, from China through the steppe grasslands into the Caspian region, into Persia, and into Eastern Europe. In other words, that steppe grassland as a sort of road, an area of movement from east to west, from west to east, between China and Rome, and of course commonly referred to as the Silk Road. The Silk Road's a little bit of a misleading term. It tends to conjure the impression of a road. What it really is a sort of network of trading routes from one town to the next, from small caravan outposts to the next. Again, not many people making the whole journey from one end to the other, although there probably were some. So vectors of trade, vectors of the spread of ideas. This is the diffusion of Buddhism, beginning in northern India and spreading from there, as you can see, both by overland and by seaborne routes into Southeast Asia, and ultimately into China, into Japan, into Tibet. The division there, the development of Mahayana or Great Vehicle Buddhism. By the time Buddhism gets to China and gets to Japan, it is essentially transformed. We talked about a transformation of Christianity in the last lecture. It's essentially transformed into a state religion. It becomes part of the sort of organizing principle of the Chinese empires. So having looked at the connections, I want to say a little bit about vectors of trade, but also vectors of military, routes of military conquest. So most of the time, the semi-nomadic pastoralists moving seasonally, small groups, but occasionally combining, joining forces, forming broader tribal alliances. Nobody knows, loads of theories, but they're theories. Why? Climatic change, changes in the volume of trade, population pressure. I mean, there's a number of potential explanations. What's for sure is that when they combine, they form extremely effective military force. Fast-moving, trained from childhood to ride, to shoot a bow and arrow from horseback, full gallop, to be able to travel tremendous distances, to put up with enormous personal hardships, organized into military forces. They have scouting forces that go out ahead. They're well disciplined. Maybe not your normal image of the sort of Mongol hordes. They're actually very highly organized. And both ends of Eurasia putting pressure, constant, although the intensity varies, on China and on the Roman Empire and its successors. So I want to say a little bit about that, and particularly to begin by saying something about the sort of patterns of Chinese history in this period. And obviously, I'm doing this this is very general. Okay, so we talked about Han China previously. They face pressure on the northern border and the northeastern border. The Xiongnu, the Yurchen, semi-nomadic tribes raiding into China, raiding into the settled communities of China, and the Chinese responding with military force, wars of conquest, pushing out the pushing out, expanding outwards the zones of direct Chinese control, forming marriage alliances, diplomatic alliances to try and force the nomadic tribes into sort of subservience to the Chinese state, and as you all know, building a huge wall or network of walls across the northern part of China to defend China from the nomadic incursions. So here, for example, Tang Dynasty China from the early 600s through to the 900s. You can see expanding both northwards into Manchuria. Korea is actually a subordinate state to China at this time, in the south into northern Vietnam, but in particular this huge westward expansion along the line of the Silk Road. So I'm choosing the Tang here because they were particularly militarily aggressive, but so they go further. They have very effective military forces, but they are by no means unusual in the overall pattern of Chinese military response to the incursions of the steppe nomadic people. So constant, as I say, different levels of intensity, but constant border conflict, constant military mobilization by the various Chinese dynasties. And you can see it's not a one-way process. One of the other things that's very, very interesting about the Tang, the place of the horse in Tang culture, the assimilation of some of the sort of traditions and martial virtues of the semi-nomadic peoples who they're fighting. So this is a porcelain horse of the Tang era. A lot of Tang art includes features horses, Tang poetry likewise. Really a dynamic interaction between the agricultural-based Chinese dynastic states and the semi-nomadic. I keep wanting to say barbarian, but if you can use that term without it having a pejorative implication, barbarian societies, nomadic societies on China's border. So this imposes a sort of certain pattern on Chinese history. So the left-hand illustration here is population over time, from what did I say? From 400 to 1800. So this is a big period. This is a big period of history. I was going to see how close to this I can get with the microphone, but maybe I better not. So you can see. Okay. So this is the Tang dynasty. This is the Han, the little bump at the far end there. So that's the parallel with Rome. You can see getting up about, this is the 50 million mark. The decline of the Han dynasty. The Tang here starts to rise again. Big expansion under the Song dynasty. And then this big dip here is the conquest of China by the Mongols, the Yuan dynasty. Almost halves the Chinese population, and then that next upturn, the beginnings of the Ming dynasty. So you're seeing this pattern of growth, expansion. Economic growth, population growth, consolidation of the dynasty, and then at a certain point, what should we say, imperial overstretch, the difficulty of maintaining permanent military mobilization, the beginnings of regional power, military officers in the provinces sort of asserting their independence from the central state, the tax burden on the on the peasantry to maintain this army, beginning to provoke peasant revolts, all of that series of factors often intersecting with the pressure from the steppe nomads, a period of collapse, often combined with nomadic raids into China until a new dynasty emerges. And begins the process of restabilization and a new period of growth. So there's an upward trend in population, but there's a sort of cyclical pattern here of growth, overextension, and collapse that is interwoven with the pressure I've been describing from the steppe nomads. Interestingly, even when you have the population growth, we're seeing a sort of extension of agriculture rather than a great leap in agricultural productivity. So the right-hand chart, gross domestic product per capita, the blue line is China. In fact, there'll be a few more bumps in it. It's not completely accurate, but you're seeing over that whole period from the year 1 right through to whatever it goes up to, let's say to 1800 there, no great advance in gross domestic product per capita, no great advance in the average living standard of the Chinese peasantry, even in the periods of economic expansion. This is often referred to as, by historians as a high-level equilibrium. In other words, the maintenance and extension of agriculture rather than the breakthrough to significant new advances in agricultural productivity that would have sustained the possibility of real qualitative rather than quantitative economic growth. So these are well-run societies, these are highly cultured, long periods of stability, but we have this general cyclical pattern in Chinese history. Okay, I want to contrast that to what happens in Western Europe. You're probably all somewhat familiar. We talked a little bit in the last lecture about the growth of the Western Roman Empire, the slave-based economy of the Western Roman Empire. So I'm talking primarily Italy, Spain, Gaul, Britain, southern Britain. The attempt to expand the Roman Empire into Germany fails in the early years of the Common Era. No new slaves, or the number of new slaves greatly reduced. The consequence of that, by the time you get into the 200s and 300s, there's already signs of economic decline in the Western Empire. The slave economy stagnates. We get significant soil erosion. We have, typically for slave societies, there's a lack of technical innovation. Slaves, for obvious reasons, are not particularly highly motivated to find smart new ways of doing things. It doesn't improve their situation any to do so. So, for example, although water mill technology is known, it's only employed in the Western Empire to a very, very limited degree. In fact, by the time you get into the 300s, those big slave plantations, the colonia, a lot of them are freeing their slaves. They're not really free, they're going to remain tied to the land, but they are going to be able to do some farming for themselves. So we start to see, emerging out of the Roman Empire, the sort of what will become the medieval serfs. That's to say, they're tied to the land. They're not free labourers. They have to pay rent, usually in kind, to the landlord. If the land's sold, they're sold with it. But they have some capacity to farm for themselves, to sell the surplus on the market. This is pretty limited to begin with. in the period of the Roman Empire. It overlaps with a weakening of the central authority of the Roman Empire. Provincial generals are going to get increasingly powerful. We're going to have a series of civil wars as the central control of the empire starts to weaken. And then in the 400s, we're going to have a dramatic change, signified by the German tribes crossing the Rhine and breaking into the Western Roman Empire. So you can see some of the routes there. The Franks up in the north going into northern France, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Yellow Line going all the way down through Spain, crossing into North Africa, and then coming back into Italy from the south. All of these are Iron Age village-level societies in Germany. And what's driving them, what's forcing them, what's causing their migration is the fact of the red line you see here, which is the Huns. So the horseback, pastoral, semi-nomadic warrior peoples who I've just been describing, moving westward and sort of driving the German tribes before them, pushing them into the Roman Empire, and of course followed by the Huns themselves, who are going to sweep through a good part of northern France as well. So you can see here the impact of these steppe nomadic peoples coming across into Western Europe, into the Roman Empire, and of course precipitating the collapse of the Roman Empire as a centralized and organized imperial structure. This is really rapid. The empire collapses in about 20 or so years. It's going to be followed by a tremendous deurbanization. We go from a society in which urban centers were basically where the elites lived. They made their money or they made their wealth on plantations, but they mostly lived in towns. Most of that's going to disappear. By the time you get into 500, 600, the old Roman towns are largely deserted. People living maybe just in one little section of the town or something like that. The collapse of long-distance trade, a lot of what the Romans referred to as brigandage, a lot of gangs of robbers basically roaming around, a collapse of the very law-organized Roman society. So this is what we refer to as the Dark Ages. There's a lot of scholarship. A lot of scholars have argued that over the last 20 years or so that they really weren't quite as dark as we think they were. They are pretty darn dark. I mean, the deurbanization, the collapse of broader state structures is absolutely real. The one exception is the Catholic Church. The one organization that maintains any kind of European-wide organization, both through its monasteries and through its pastoral structure, is still centralized in Rome, is the Catholic Church, and it's through this sort of very thin conduit that the culture of antiquity is going to pass into subsequent European civilizations. But it's the only thing. Everywhere else we have a collapse into localism. And all the other features I've just described. This is going to be reinforced. I had to put this in for Jim because he was on about the Vikings the other week. So this is reinforced by what's sometimes described as the siege of Europe. We're talking about the 800s and 900s now. So we are starting to get a little bit of reorganization of society, of kingdoms in Western Europe, but continual pressure. So here you have the Vikings. raiding out of Scandinavia into Britain, actually taking over a chunk of Britain, Ireland, northern France. You can see sailing round into the Mediterranean. You can see coming down the Dnieper and the Volga, the Don, the big rivers of Russia, modern-day Russia, Ukraine, into the Black Sea, ending up in Constantinople, where they serve as mercenaries for the Byzantine Empire. The Pink Line, the Magyar, another semi-nomadic incursion from modern-day Hungary, the very western end of the Eurasian steppe, into central Europe, down into Italy, like the Huns, raiding, pillaging, breaking up those moves towards more centralized states. This begins in 400, the invasions into the Western Empire, and we're going to see this really going on through the 900s, continuous military incursions into what had been the former western part of the Roman Empire. Unlike China, we're not going to see a re-establishment of the Roman Empire. We're not going to see some period of decline and breakdown and then a similar political structure, a similar economic structure arise in Western Europe. Instead, we're going to see this very long 500-600 year period of a real throwback in the level of civilization, level of social organization, level of economic organization in Western Europe. But the very slow germination of a new form of social organization. And what I'm talking about, schematic on the right here, the emergence of a feudal economy, feudal social relations. So you still have these serfs at the bottom. A lot of them, of course, had been former slaves, but sort of overlaid on top of that, you have the noble elites. Some of them from Germanic origin, some of them from Roman. In British case, some of them British, some of them Roman, and a sort of tiered social structure with military obligations to the next level above you, and at the very bottom, the serfs, tied to the land. Owing a large amount of labor duties to their landlords, to the knights whose land they live on, but little opportunity to develop their own wealth, to hoard a little bit, to grow a little surplus, to start selling the surplus, and so on and so forth. The other thing I just want to point out briefly in Turkey. In Anatolia, in Greece, the continued existence of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern, what's often referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire. So different pattern for what happens in the Western Roman Empire, where the collapse is very dramatic. The old slave-based Western Roman Empire. A little bit of a different pattern in the Eastern Empire, often referred to in European scholarship as the Byzantine Empire, but they always referred to themselves as Romans. They always saw themselves as Romans. Urban society centered in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. Free peasants, not serfs. Heavily taxed, heavily exploited, but bound in servitude as the former slave population of the West is. So, Byzantine Empire under pressure from the east, from the semi-nomadic tribes that I've been describing, but a long period a long struggle. Constantinople finally overthrown by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So 1,000 years after Rome is overthrown, Byzantium finally falls. The Eastern Roman Empire finally comes to an end. I raise that because we tend to think of the fall of Rome and think about the Western Empire, but actually the Roman Empire, as they saw themselves, continues in the East. Okay, that all sets up what I want to just talk a little bit about, which is the next phase of pastoralist, semi-nomadic eruption, and this is going to come not from Eurasia, but from the Arabian Peninsula. So the emergence of Islam in the early 600s, Muhammad and his followers are expelled from Mecca in 622. They return in 630. They capture Mecca. Muhammad himself dies shortly afterwards, but his successors launch a really dramatic series of military campaigns over the next couple of hundred years, and a succession of ever greater caliphates, ever greater geographical area caliphates, the Rashidun, Umayyad, and Abbasid caliphate. So the illustration here is the Abbasid caliphate, so 750 to 1258. So a huge area, all of the Middle East. Into the Indus River in the east, all of North Africa, all of the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. Like the steppe nomads, these like the Huns, like the Magyars, horseback, fast-moving, highly organized, although they continue to largely fight on foot. Exploit a particular moment of weakness in the Byzantine Empire, defeat the Byzantines at Yarmouk in 636, and establish their control over Arab control over a great swath of the Middle East. Interestingly, they're not particularly interested in converting people. Under Islamic law, you can't tax fellow Muslims, so there's really no economic incentive to convert people to Islam. It's actually better from their point of view if they don't convert, because you can tax them more. Heavily. So you're often going to have a situation of big armed encampments of Arab warriors. Cities with Arab elites, but ruling over the indigenous populations without overturning without forcibly converting them, so the populations are going to remain Christian or Jewish or Zoroastrian in faith. The Muslim forces are going to spread south of the Sahara, initially by trading salt from the Mediterranean for gold from the Niger River area in south of the Sahara, but the Almoravid Berbers, so this is basically the Moroccans convert to Islam and then cross the Sahara and start to carve out a Muslim state, Islamic state, south of the Sahara. The most substantial, the Mongolian Empire. So we're getting into the 1200s here, and here's the king. Mansa Musa, he's shown here holding a great nugget of gold, in, I forget, 1236, something like that. He goes makes the Hajj to Mecca, travels through sub-Saharan, through the Sahel, south of the Sahara, through Egypt, and then down into down into Arabia, distributing gold as he goes. A real demonstration of the power and organization of the Muslim states south of the Sahara. So again, we're starting to see through these vectors of migration, conquest, assimilation, what you really have in the Mongolian Empire is a sort of Islamic elite presiding over a still largely traditional African society, and a lot of African elements working their way into the practice of Islam in these regions. So the Arab expansion, the Muslim expansion during this period. Okay, so bet you've all been waiting for the Mongols. So we're a little bit later. This is the greatest, most powerful of the semi-nomadic eruptions. Genghis Khan becomes the central leader of the Muslims, of the Mongols, 1206, and over the next period, himself and then his successors, his two successors, Ogedai Khan and Kublai Khan, are going to create the largest geographical area of any imperial state in human history. It ends at its height in 1279 with the overthrow of the Song dynasty in China, the establishment of the Yuan dynasty. So this is the one occasion when the semi-nomadic peoples actually do overturn the Chinese dynasty and establish their own control, their own state in China. There's a hand compared to the size of the Chinese population. There's a very small numbers of them, but they are going to dominate China for a period. Persia. The caliphate is overthrown by the capture of Baghdad in 1258 by the Mongols. So the Abbasid Caliphate is toppled. In Russia, someone asked about Russia in a previous lecture. We're going to see the Mongols, particularly the gold, as they break up, the Golden Horde, moving into Eastern Europe. The principalities of Moscow and Kiev, basically they are going to become subordinate tributary states to the Mongols. So the Russian kingdoms, the Russian principalities, particularly Novgorod and Alexander Nevsky, is going to basically become a Mongol ally in Eastern Europe and resist fighting the Catholic Poles and Swedes and allying with the Mongols. So we talked a little bit previously about the sort of two, I don't mean it in a pejorative way, two-faced kind of character of Russia, facing towards feudal Europe on the one hand, and on the other, these powerful interactions with the Mongols, the steppe nomads of Eurasia on the other. Into India. So again, we're going to see the waves of conquest into India. These are not actually by the Mongols themselves, but sort of driven forward by the Mongol by the Mongol expansion. A new Islamic state in northern India, and then expanding its power throughout the whole of the Indian subcontinent. So at its height, the Mongols from China all the way through to Russia, into Persia, into Mesopotamia, influencing the developments in India, really a gigantic empire, but very light in terms of the of its administration. Really. Not really what you would think of as a centralized state, although there's some centralized tax collection. There's a small permanent sort of imperial guard, but there's no large permanent army. The Mongol military is based on the tribal mobilizations that I've been describing. The consequence, go back to the map, immediately after Genghis Khan's death, the empire starts to fragment into these separate sections. The Golden Horde in the north, northwest, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and then Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty China in the east. So very quickly, the great unity of the Mongol Empire begins to break up. The challenge for nomads, of course, is what if you win, if you seize power, if you start to become a sort of stable ruling elite, you stop being a nomad. And your power is based on nomadism. Your power is based on the capacity to mobilize the warrior, semi-nomadic warrior tribes. This is the constant tension in one dynasty China, and of course, ultimately the weakness of the Yuan regime. Okay, the final Steppe Empire is going to follow shortly thereafter, known in English as Tamerlane, the Empire of Timur. Timur claims descent from Genghis Khan and the Mongols, although that's not actually technically true, but he certainly operates in a similar fashion. And again, another series of expansions, another series of wars of conquest, Persia, Afghanistan, northern India, the Transcaucasus, etc. So another big steppe empire. They sack Delhi. They overthrow the Delhi Sultanate in 1398. But after Tamerlane's death, 1405, the empire, as the Mongols had done, the empire begins very rapidly to disintegrate. This is often taken as the last steppe empire. This is often regarded as the end of the steppe challenge to the settled agricultural peoples around the fringes of Eurasia. In future, those states are going to be too strong, too powerfully organized, and we're not going to see any further major nomadic incursions. That is not totally true. In fact, the three major states in South Asia, South and West Asia that emerge in the early modern period, I'm talking about into the early 1500s now, are all, to one degree or another, the product of that interrelationship between the steppe nomads and the settled agricultural peoples. So the Mughal Empire in India, a further semi-nomadic incursion into northern India, 1526, Babur, one of the descendants of Timur. Again, the sort of classic pattern that I've described before, conquering the Indus and Ganges valleys, building powerful support. This is now Islam. These are now Islamic. They've converted to Islam. So we have the continued domination of northern India by Islamic forces ruling over the majority Hindu population. Secondly, the Safavid Empire in Persia. Also connected to the steppe peoples to the north, growing out of that interaction. And then finally, over on the left there, the green, the Ottoman Empire, which I've touched on previously. So the Turkic peoples, the Ottoman Turks coming into eastern Anatolia. It takes them several hundred years, but finally overthrowing Constantinople in 1453 and moving into the Balkans. So we have the expansion of the Ottoman Turkey into Southeast Europe, basically. The picture on the right here is the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, when they defeat the Hungarian Holy Roman Empire army. So big military pressure on Eastern Europe, going right into the early modern period. Collectively, these are referred to as the gunpowder empires. So it gives you a little clue. We're starting to see gunpowder technology. These are now they certainly the Safavid and Ottoman empires, and both use slave soldiers, armed with gunpowder weapons. So they're not exactly steppe empires, although they all are a product of that interaction. Long series of interactions between these steppe nomads and the settled societies to their fringe. And these are going to be the three of the major states of the early modern world. Finally, I just want to say something about the final sort of phase of steppe nomadic conquest in China. The end of the Ming Dynasty in 1644. That cyclical pattern I described before, sort of reasserting itself, and this time the Manchu from the green area there on the map there, from Manchuria. From invading, or actually first being invited in and then overthrowing the Ming Dynasty and establishing their own regime in China. This is the foundation of the Qing Dynasty. It's going to last, of course, from 1644 right through to the overthrow of the last imperial dynasty in China in 1911. So very long-lived, but it's going to remain to some degree a regime of conquest. The Manchu elite always remains ethnically distinct from the Han Chinese population. They organize to some degree separately. They have separate military forces, although to rule China, of course, they're going to rely on the Chinese the traditional Chinese civil service. They're going to assimilate a lot of Chinese traditions, and so on. I wanted to sort of throw those in: China, Mughal India, Safavid Persia, Ottoman Turkey. Basically, all of them are products of those interactions between the steppe nomads and the settled peoples, agricultural societies. So the end of the Timurid Empire in 1405, it is the last sort of uniquely steppe empire, but it's not quite the end of this sort of process of interaction, conquest, cultural assimilation, both aspects of that, which are really going to go on to form these really major and important states of the early modern period. Having said that, we're going to see strong. These are all going to emerge, all going to develop as strong, permanently settled, powerfully armed states, and we're not going to see any further expansion, any further eruptions from the Eurasian steppes. The next challenge, of course, to these sort of Eurasian rimlands from China, India, around, is not going to come from the steppes. The next challenge, of course, is going to come from the sea, and it's going to be waged by Europeans. And so we'll move on and talk about that in the next lecture next week. So this is sort of bridging those periods and sort of tying together the whole history of Eurasia in that way. And we're now going to see, as feudalism develops, we're now going to see a different trajectory in Western Europe. We're going to see the rise of Western Europe and then its capacity to impose itself over the next couple of hundred years on South and East Asia. So anyway, let's take a few questions.